Hello and welcome to this PIR live event webinar, brought to you in part by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Ben Hobbs and I will be your host today. If you're joining us live, remember that you can ask questions at any time by clicking Q&A located near the bottom center of your screen and typing your questions into the pop-up window. I will relay your questions to our guests during the Q&A portion of this webinar. If you see a question in there that you would also like the answer to, you can prioritize it by clicking the thumbs up icon that will be located just below that question. Joining us today to talk about the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project is Dr. Alex Latta. Dr. Latta is an associate professor in the Department of Global Studies and the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Latta. I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, thanks very much, Ben. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone today to talk about this controversial topic and hopefully help you to understand a bit more about the controversy about it. So I want to start off by just asking that question of why this is important. Clearly, we've had a good turnout today, so others think it's important too. One reason it's important to you is that you and I, we're all part owners now of this pipeline. So that's a reason to think hard about it. Secondly, these are decisions about pipelines like this that really matter to our future. They matter to our economy, but they also matter to our environment. Climate change is really tied up in the debates about this question. And finally, this pipeline project brings to the surface difficult questions around the relationships between settler society, that is Canada, and Indigenous peoples. Those are at stake in this debate, and so they really drive some of the controversy. So before we start talking about this pipeline in particular, obviously we need to understand what pipelines are for. Well, when we pump oil out of the ground, we can't use it right away. We can't stick it in our cars right away. We need to refine it. And so we need to get it to those refineries where it's changed into a whole bunch of different end products that serve our economy. Of course, the most product that you're most familiar with is probably gasoline that you put in your car to get around the city. So when we're talking pipelines, we're talking about these connections between these parts in this system. And we're really here today talking about this part here between where the oil comes out of the ground and where it gets refined. That's the nature of the pipeline that we're discussing. Now, oil moves in other ways as well. It moves by rail significantly, and also later in the process, it moves by tanker truck. But pipelines are the most important. So if we look at North America, and we look at where Canada is producing most of its oil here in northern Alberta, we have to ask ourselves, how is that oil going to get to the places where it's going to be refined so that it can be used in the economy? Well, Canada has quite a bit of refining capacity on the East Coast in New Brunswick. But there's a lot more refining capacity down on the Gulf Coast of the United States. And of course, there's always the option of shipping oil somewhere else to be refined and brought to markets in other parts of the world, like China. There are other refining opportunities throughout North America, but these are really the main ones. So if you look at where that oil is being produced, there's some distance separating it from any of these options. And so what I want to do now, I'm just going to stop this slideshow briefly and take you to a web page where I want to just look at what that pipeline system looks like. So this is the Oil Sands magazine. It's an industry magazine. We're going to go to project data here. It's an industry magazine about the oil sands, and it tells us a lot of things about what's going on there. This kind of source is a really good one to find information about this kind of thing. If you're doing research projects, you just have to be aware that this kind of magazine is coming from a particular perspective. Okay, so here we go. This is a map of the pipelines that currently exist in the North American context. And what I want you to observe here is this really strong north to south alignment of most of these pipelines. So like I said, a lot of that refining capacity is down here along the Gulf Coast. And so that's where a lot of the pipelines are going. If we look at east-west movement, we have a pipeline that comes out here through southern Ontario, but then it dips off into the United States here On the West Coast, we have one pipeline that brings oil out to the coast, and that's the one we're going to talk about, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So you can see that because most of our oil is moving north-south right now, we don't have a lot of choice in terms of where we're sending it. And that's part of the question about why, and part of the reason why this pipeline is seen as so important. Okay, so back to the presentation. So let me give you a bit of the backstory of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and tell you about that expansion project so that we can understand what this is all about. So like I said, we're looking at this western part of Canada, the southern British Columbia. The pipeline starts in Alberta and then passes through southern British Columbia. So the Trans Mountain Pipeline was established as a Crown corporation, that is a state corporation, in 1951, and it pumped its first oil a couple of years later. It's a long pipeline, over 1,000 kilometers long. You can see it there snaking down from Edmonton all the way through the Rockies and then down all the way to Burnaby, which is right beside Vancouver. That's where the pumping station is to put this oil onto tankers. And so the next thing that happened in terms of who owned this was 1994. It was actually purchased by a company in British Columbia called Terrasson Gas. And then our story about the expansion really starts in 2005 when Terrasson Gas was purchased by Kinder Morgan, which is an American energy company, pipeline company. And they were interested in the Trans Mountain Pipeline because they saw some potential here. They said, you know, if we put another pipeline along this route, we could really expand the amount of oil that's being exported this way. And so that's what they proposed. In 2012, they proposed the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. And this is a big project. It would almost triple the amount of oil flowing along this route for shipping off of the West Coast. Now, their project was assessed in 2016, met the approval process, finished the approval process with the National Energy Board of Canada, and that led the federal government to give its stamp of approval to this project in that year. But as that was happening, protest was beginning to mount about this project. So who was opposing the project? Well, First Nations groups, for instance, like the British Columbia Union of Indian Chiefs, environmental groups like the Western Canada Wilderness Committee and the Rain Coast Conservation Foundation. We also had some local governments like the municipality of Burnaby, where that pipeline ends up. They were against the project. And finally, in British Columbia in 2017, we had a provincial election that changed the government. The government before was in favor of the pipeline. Afterwards, the government was against, the new government was against, and joined the opposition to the pipeline. So we ended up with mounting opposition to this pipeline, including a court case that was being taken forward through the courts up to the Federal Court of Appeal. And Kinder Morgan was observing this and saying, well, said to the government of Canada, you know, this is tough for us because there's a lot of uncertainty here. If you can't clarify that uncertainty, we may just bail on this project. And so what the federal government did was they decided to offer Kinder Morgan $4.5 billion to buy this pipeline. And Kinder Morgan considered this, and August 30th of last year, their shareholders approved that purchase. So we became owners of this pipeline. But that very same day, the Federal Court of Appeal ruled on the court case that had arrived to it and overturned the project's approval. So we became owners of a project that was no longer approved. That left us in a bit of a pickle. So what did the federal government do? Well, they have instructed the National Energy Board to conduct a 6-month reconsideration process. And that's going to end pretty soon in mid-February. So you can bet that this pipeline is going to be back in the news roughly within a month. So I want to dig now into the question of why this pipeline is so controversial. I'm going to do that by just playing out some of the arguments against the pipeline and some of the responses from those who are in favor. So what do the critics say? And I'm oversimplifying here. I'm just going to give 3 big arguments. There's lots of other arguments we can explore in the questions and answers, but 3 big ones. First of all, critics say First Nations have not given their consent to this project. And in fact, the Federal Court of Appeal agreed that they had not been properly consulted. That's one of the reasons why it ruled to cancel the approvals. Also, the increased tanker traffic out of Vancouver will put marine habitats at risk. And the Federal Court of Appeal agreed that the risk, in particular for killer whales, needed to be reevaluated. And then finally, expanding tar sands production is going to contribute to global warming. Critics are really concerned about this. We can't get more oil out of the ground and sell it to be burned off somewhere in the world without contributing to global warming. And this pipeline is going to allow the expansion of the tar sands production. So that's what the critics say. What do those in favor say? Well, they point out that many First Nations are actually in favor of the project and have signed agreements to receive benefits from it. They also point out that there's already tanker traffic in Vancouver and all kinds of other boat traffic and shipping traffic. They point out that this project is bringing with it new funding to improve emergency response plans in case of a spill. And they also argue that, Canada's economy is strongly linked to oil. If we can't get a good price for that oil, then, our economy is going to suffer. And in order to get that good price, we need to have the capacity to transport that oil from where it's produced to where it can be refined and sold. We also need access to markets other than just the United States. So this economic argument is a really big one. Now, those are the arguments. There's a lot at stake here. So let me just take a couple minutes to dig a bit deeper. First of all, one thing that's at stake is this relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Government of Canada. And that is a difficult relationship. And how could it not be? Because really we're talking about a pipeline passing over land that's part of this country we call Canada that was formed through colonization, where a bunch of Europeans came here, took land away from Indigenous peoples, and created a new country. That's really what's at stake in part of these debates, is that colonial legacy. A second aspect that makes this really controversial is bitumen, which is what we call the oil that comes out of the tar sands. This is a controversial resource, in part because, as I already mentioned, it can contribute to global warming. But secondly, because this oil, it isn't free-flowing oil. It's bound up with sand in the soil. And getting it out is very destructive environmentally. So this is what that part of the country looks like. It's boreal forest, lots of rivers and lakes as well. And beneath it is all of these oil sands, the sand saturated in oil. And this is what it takes to get it out. We need to mine that sand in order to process it. Now, there are other ways of getting the oil out of the sand, some of them less destructive than this, but there's a lot of this kind of mining going on in the tar sands. And that mining process also, in order to get the oil out of the sand so that we can then stick it in a pipeline, produces these, what we call tailing ponds. These are ponds of contaminated water. So, the tar sands are very controversial because of all of these environmental risks and impacts. And that, any pipeline linked to the tar sands is going to be controversial. Finally, to touch on that end of the pipeline point where this oil is already being put in tankers, but where the tripling of the capacity would mean many more tankers and more risk. Southern British Columbia, this is a fragile ocean ecosystem, and it suffered a lot of impacts already from different kinds of things. And the southern resident killer whale population is endangered. There's only 74 individuals left in this population, and so it really is a concern. The decisions that we make here will have an impact on the risks to these endangered species. So just about done, but before we finish and get to questions, I want to point out that actually, if you've been watching the news over the past week or so, there's a different pipeline that's been in the news and been the subject of some pretty hot debate. This is the Coastal GasLink pipeline, and it's in sort of mid to northern British Columbia, not to move oil, but to move gas. And this pipeline crosses through the traditional territory of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation. And the Unistoten clan of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation a few years ago set up a checkpoint and a gate, essentially, to prevent pipeline workers from accessing the site to build this pipeline. And on, I think it was January 7th, the RCMP, enforcing a court order, moved in, took down the barricades and arrested 14 people. There were subsequently protests across the country, and this is still very much an issue in the news. And I share this with you because the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion is a very controversial project, but it's only one of many. And pipelines these days seem to be very controversial because of their link to climate change, but also because of their link to these questions about Indigenous territory and the relationship between governments and industry and Indigenous peoples. So that's it for me. I'm happy to take whatever questions you might have.
Well, thank you, Alex. Thank you for illuminating some of those issues for us. It's very interesting. Just before we transition into the Q&A here, I'd like to remind those classrooms to direct their questions to the Q&A pop-up window, which can be found in the bottom center of your screen. So our first question today comes from the Meekin Mills High School team in Markham, Ontario, and they would like to know, why don't we refine our own oil here?
Okay, that's a very good question. We do refine a very small amount of our oil in Canada, and in particular, as I mentioned, there is some oil refining capacity particularly in New Brunswick. There was another pipeline proposal in the works a few years back, 2 or 3 years ago, called the Energy East Pipeline, that would have brought a pipeline all the way from northern Alberta out to New Brunswick, so that we would be refining more of our own oil. There was lots of resistance to that pipeline as well. It was going to flow through quite close to Montreal and other Indigenous communities along that route. It was a much longer pipeline as well. So this is one of the issues. We don't have the refining capacity built. And the reason why we don't build more refining capacity is it's very expensive to refine, to build that capacity, and you want to be pretty close to your market. So it's better to build refineries closer to markets. And also refineries are not popular. They are themselves very polluting. And so it's difficult to put a refinery, to build a new refinery. People don't want to have them in their backyard. So there's a whole set of issues around refining that mean that Canada really doesn't have, at least at this point, good options to refine our own oil.
Well, thank you. Our next question today comes from Ms. Baggio's grade 6-7 classroom from Corona, and they're wondering if Imperial Oil or Shell would be a manufacturer.
Would be a manufacturer?
Yes.
I don't, well, it depends on what you mean by the question, which isn't entirely clear to me, but oil companies like those two that you mentioned we tend to consider them as they're extracting a resource, which is then later used in different kinds of manufacturing processes. So, Shell is providing oil to the market, and then that oil is bought up by different companies that then make things out of it, like plastics. Now, Shell is refining and selling gasoline, so in that sense, perhaps we could think of it as manufacturing, but we don't generally use that term. But certainly when you put gasoline in your car, it's no longer the same as the natural resource that came out of the ground. So a kind of manufacturing process is involved. I hope
okay. Our next question today comes from Ms. Wright's classroom, and they're wondering, are some pipelines put underground?
Yes, that's a good question, and yes, they are. And there are all kinds of issues around what's the best way to put a pipeline in place. Generally, they do tend to go above ground because it's much more expensive to dig a trench and put them in them, and also because you want to be able to monitor them, and so you can't monitor them if you can't see them. So normally pipelines are traveling above the ground, but in certain instances, they may go below the ground. For instance, there's a pipeline right now in the Northwest Territories near some of the communities where I work, where they are putting the pipeline underneath the river. And so that's a big project, and that's just one example, but most of that pipeline is also above ground.
And as a follow-up to that question, we have a classroom wondering if those underground pipelines affect animals living underground in those areas.
It's a good question. I think, though, that mostly if a pipeline is buried, it's probably buried at a depth that is below where many of the underground animals would live. So I think that I think that a pipeline, wherever it's built, would affect, it affects animals of all kinds above and below ground. If you had a spill from a pipeline, even from a pipeline that's above ground, that spill, the oil would sink into the ground, and so those animals that live in the ground would be affected by it. So it maybe doesn't really matter whether it's above ground or below ground to think about those kinds of impacts.
Doesn't seem easy to avoid those environmental impacts for sure. Our next question is coming from Ms. McCormick's classroom, and they're wondering, has the Canadian government offered financial compensation for the land that we'll be using, that is land that belongs to the Indigenous peoples?
That's a very good question as well. My understanding is that there's no government offer of compensation. Usually what happens in cases like this, and it happens with not just pipelines, but also mining and forestry and other kinds of resource development that happens in Indigenous territories. Usually what happens is that the company negotiates with the community something that's called an impact benefit agreement. And that agreement sort of sets out, well, what are the impacts going to be, and what kinds of benefits could you receive as a community in sort of an exchange for those impacts. And so in this case, with this pipeline, there are 43 First Nations governments that have signed agreements with Trans Mountain, the company that would build the pipeline. And those agreements most of them are private, so we don't know what's in them, but usually they contain some sort of promise of benefits, whether that's employment or money for community centers or training, stuff like that.
So our next question today is from Ms. Hartman's class from Scarborough, Ontario, and they would like to know, what are the key differences between moving oil using boats or trains or a pipeline?
Okay, that's a really good question. We are moving a lot of oil by train right now, and partly that's because we don't have the capacity in our pipelines. And I don't know if you might not remember this. This was, I think, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. There was a really big disaster where a train that was carrying oil, they didn't put the brakes on strongly enough, and it went downhill into Lac Mégantic, Quebec, and it exploded right in the middle of the town, and something like 40 or 50 people were killed. And many more were injured, and the town was destroyed. So that's an example of the dangers of moving oil by rail. It's generally considered that pipelines are the safest way of moving oil. That said, when a pipeline does have a spill, if that spill isn't detected, the oil will just keep flowing and flowing and flowing. And there have been cases of spills like that where the detection for some reason has not occurred soon enough, and a lot of oil gets out. If a train derails and a couple tanker cars are burst, then that is just a couple tanker cars, and there's usually less spill. So there's trade-offs both ways. Trains are probably more prone to accidents, but maybe not as much oil would flow out. A pipeline, less prone to accidents, but potentially a lot of oil. And then you ask about boats too, and so ultimately, to get our oil to markets outside North America, we do have to put that oil on ships. And there are some examples of some pretty awful oil spills from big tankers where they've run aground and the oil has spilled out of them. If that kind of spill happened in the inshore waters in British Columbia, like between Vancouver Island and the mainland, where there's a lot of islands there and a lot of sea life, but it's very enclosed, it would be pretty hard to clean up. And because it's enclosed, not a lot of water flows through it, so it would take many, many years for it to become clean again. So those are some of the risks, and I'm not an expert on that aspect of it by any means, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea.
And we have a question here from Mr. Heath's classroom, and they're wondering, what are the alternatives to this pipeline expansion project? If we stop this project today, what would we do?
Well, in a sense, we're already doing something instead of this project, because this project was kind of expected to be already built or almost built. It's been slowed down by all of this debate. And as a result, in Alberta, they've expanded the production in the oil sands, but they don't actually have the capacity to get the stuff that they're producing to market. And so the government of Canada and the government of Alberta have been looking at alternatives. And in particular, there's government funding now to buy more rail cars to move more oil by rail. So that's the main alternative is rail. Or of course, there's the alternative of not getting the oil out of the ground in the first place. And as someone who's very concerned about climate change, I have to say that alternative seems like it doesn't get the consideration that it deserves. And if you look at the scientific projections about climate change and about the remaining oil resources that we have, that science tells us we have to leave a bunch of that oil in the ground if we don't want the drastic climate change that we're beginning to see. So there are alternatives for moving the oil, but then there's also the alternative of leaving the oil in the ground, which is not a popular one to talk about.
Our next question today comes from Miss Blackbeach's class from St. Anne's School, and they're wondering, why is the government spending all this money on something that could potentially be so harmful for the environment when we could be spending this money on something that would make our country healthier or better for its people?
Yeah, that's a really tough question, and it's a tough question because, the reason why the government's spending this money is because it wants to have a healthy economy, and it wants to save jobs in the oil sector. It wants Alberta's oil sector to be strong. Alberta produces a lot of oil, employs a lot of Canadians, contributes a lot to our national economy. And if we don't build this pipeline, Alberta's economy is going to suffer. There's going to be fewer jobs there, and there's going to be less money going into our national economy and fewer taxes paid. So there is an economic cost to slowing down the production of oil. And so the government is spending this money on this pipeline project because they think that economic aspect is really, really important. And they're convinced that if they put in place the proper, rules and the proper monitoring, that they'll be able to make sure that there aren't accidents, that there aren't environmental damage from this. So that's the debate. It's very much a environment versus economy kind of debate.
Mm-hmm. Our next question comes from Mr. Gordon's classroom, and they're wondering, how big of an impact will this pipeline have on animals in the environment specifically?
Well, the pipeline itself, so because this is a twinning of an existing pipeline, they're putting a pipe beside one that already exists, there is the argument to be made that the impacts in terms of disturbing forest and putting a barrier in the way of animal movements and that kind of thing, the impacts are in some sense already there. And so this is better than building an entirely new pipeline in that sense. But then you need to look at the questions around risk of spills. And so it's hard to say what impacts this pipeline will have because we don't know if there will be spills. Now, the existing pipeline started reporting spills in 1961. And since then, there have been, I think it's like 82 or 83 spills. Most of those spills are minor. And, 7 out of 10 spills happen at pumping stations or at other sites along the pipeline where they have safety equipment and it's easy to contain those. But, 3 out of 10 of those spills happen in other parts of the pipeline where it can sometimes take a while to respond to the spill. And so, when that happens, it has an impact. Oil is toxic, and when it goes into the water in particular, it can have a really strong impact on fish, and all the other things that live in the water, and other animals. And then, of course, there's the question about the tankers. That's one where we can be pretty sure that there will be an impact because of more tanker traffic. The noise that they produce interferes with whales' ability to find their food because whales use echolocation. They sort of sing into the water, and the water is just like the way that bats find bugs to eat. What they sing into the water bounces back to them, and they hear where the fish are. That's how they hunt. So when there's a big ship going by making a whole bunch of noise, they can't hunt. And it's been documented that this is having a big impact on them. And so more tankers means more impact of that kind. And then again, that chance of a spill, that chance that there could be a catastrophic spill that would, wipe out a lot of the marine life there. But that's just a chance. So that's the big question about the risk.
You may have touched on this in a previous answer, but our next question is from Chantel in Miss Ferry's grade 6 classroom. And she is wondering, if the pipeline will increase the chance of global warming, then why is it still being considered?
Yeah, you know, it's really within Canada and I think around the world, we have, the problem that we have is that we know that we need to stop producing greenhouse gases. We know that climate change is bad, that we're contributing to it, and that if we stop using oil, that we will help, we will reduce climate change. On the other hand, our economies are so dependent on oil that it's really hard to just sort of, you know, turn the switch and say, okay, no more oil. That's really the problem, is how do we transition from an economy that's very oil-based to an economy that uses other forms of energy, and an economy that doesn't depend on oil for a lot of its jobs and that kind of thing. So this is a big issue for Canada as an oil producer. All countries face this problematic question of transition because of their use of oil, but Canada is also a producer of oil. So how do we transition away from oil without harming our economy? That's really the crux of the problem.
We're almost out of time today, but before we wrap things up, I was hoping to have you speak a little bit about your career path and maybe some advice you have for students who are thinking of something similar in their future.
Sure. Okay, so well, when I was in school, when I was your age, I was involved in an environment club in my school. We started up an environment club because we were, you know, worried about what was happening. And in my case, I lived in British Columbia. We were worried what was happening to the West Coast forests with clear cutting and that kind of thing. And we were also worried at that time about climate change and that sort of thing. So I got involved at that age in the issues, and I started learning about them. And that really, became my passion. And so then when I finished high school, I thought, well, how do I follow this passion, this desire to, you know, protect our environment and preserve a healthy planet for our future? So I decided to study geography and environmental studies, and also political science, because I wanted to understand more about the environment, but I also wanted to understand, how do we make decisions about the environment? So I went on to university education of various kinds, and eventually I ended up doing research, and I do research now with Indigenous communities in the Northwest Territories who are asking themselves, how do we protect our traditional territories, considering that there are pressures for mining and for forestry and things like that? How do we make sure that we continue to be stewards of our environment as our ancestors have been for generations? So that's the kind of thing that I'm doing now. I also teach at university, and I guess my advice to you would be to say, you know, find that passion. If you're passionate about the environment, this kind of issue, or if you're passionate about thinking about the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples, find out more, and find ways that you can get involved in talking about those issues and bringing those issues to light for the rest of your fellow students and the rest of the public. And you know, maybe you'll find your passion there as well.
That's all the time we have for today, but thank you, Dr. Latta, for taking the time to shed light on some of these important issues regarding the pipeline expansion. Next week on PIR live event, we will be discussing forensic science and bloodstain pattern analysis with Dr. Teresa Stotesbury from Trent University. More information about these webinars and other PIR educational programs are available at pirweb.org. Thanks for tuning in, and have a wonderful day.